Hey there, my name's Samandita, and you're listening to HCI Ideas. HCI Ideas is a podcast where we discuss research, receive advice, and learn about the cool things taking place at the Human Computer Interaction Institute of Carnegie Mellon University. Today, we'll be speaking with professors Chris Harrison and Scott Hudson about new input mechanisms, the evolution of HCI as a field, and the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. Thanks for tuning in. Chris and Scott, could you introduce yourselves and maybe just a little bit about your role in the HCII and what you're kind of working on research-wise?
All right. I've been here since almost at the beginning. I was the second outside hire into the HCII after Randy Pausch in 1997. So I've been here a while through pretty much all of the sort of formation and growth of the institute. We were a lot smaller back in the day. Over time, I've done quite a lot of things, but I think one important piece of that was the sort of formation, and I was director of the PhD program for quite a long time. I led the team that put together the program to begin with in 1999, and we had the first class in 2000, and over time I directed it for 15 years. So I have a lot to do with the formation and running of the PhD program. My research interests are always a bit eclectic. There's a fairly wide range of things, and it has shifted over time. I really started out my career in user interface software, but when I came to CMU, I really made a turn into the physical world, and many of the things, I should say, definitely not all of them, have a physical component to them. These days, I'm very interested in computational fabrication technologies, 3D printing being the most obvious of that, but I also do a lot of work in computational textiles. So that's sort of a quick run over some things.
And I'm Chris Harrison. I actually did my PhD here at CMU with my advisor, who's sitting right next to me, coincidentally. And I joined the faculty, I believe, in 2014. So I've been here about 10 years on the faculty. My research interests are also eclectic. I think I learned that from my advisor because
Where do you get these things?
yes, you do your best work when you're excited about that work. And people who are professors like to challenge their minds. They like to be creative. And I don't really think you can do the same thing, for a 30 or 40-year career. So I learned that in order to do the best research, you have to have fun with your research and have fun with your students and explore and be an explorer and relish curiosity and creativity. But there's still some major themes in my research, and that revolves around new interaction techniques, new input, especially powered by machine learning and AI. So a lot to do with sensors and how you make sense of sensors. Quite a bit with haptics, so the sense of touch as it's mediated by a computer, and a lot to do with how the smart home and future voice agents might be able to take advantage of context. How do if they know what's going on around them or how you're feeling, can they be better assistants? Can they be more human-like in their interactions with us? And so there's probably more than 100 research projects spanning those kind of areas.
That's really cool. So I just want to dive into your backgrounds a little bit more. So Scott, as you mentioned, you have been in the HCI field for a very, very long time. And kind of as you mentioned, you've created the very first PhD program for HCI, I think in the country.
Yes.
So what was the field of HCI like way back when you started? Kind of how has it changed?
Um, Certainly, when I started, it was a very new thing, and in fact, you've just sort of described it as a field of HCI. But I think a lot of our early efforts were to try to create a discipline of HCI. At the time, it really wasn't, and we really wanted to bring it together to create a discipline. I think that has happened over this long period of time. Because at that time, HCI was really sort of a piece of computer science or a piece of psychology or a piece of something else. And so a lot of, I think, our early efforts were to bring us together. We've always been incredibly interdisciplinary, and I think that is still our strength. And I would say we do interdisciplinary work better than anybody else I know. And, and that was always a major strength and a major part of how we were doing our work. The biggest difference I would say is really just size. We started out, I said I was one of the early hires, but at the time, everybody had a joint appointment. Almost everybody had a joint appointment. I think there were only 3 of us who had sole appointments in HCI at one point. And there were it's always hard to count because there are folks like Bobby Klatsky, who's been with the department from the very beginning, was head of psychology at that time. And yet she's never had an official appointment in HCI. She is a voting faculty member, but so it's always hard to count, but there might have been, I don't know, 15 faculty at that point, and we were just much bigger. We had 0 PhD students. We had 1 small MHCI class, and everything has really, really grown, certainly in terms of number of people, but in all aspects. And I would say HCI as a field has also changed and grown over that time. If you just think about the set of methods that get applied, it's just tremendously bigger than it was in say 97, early 2000s. All of those things have changed, but I think all along there has been sort of a real feeling that we want to do very high quality work, and that has always been a priority.
So, building on that, like you mentioned, HCI is such an interdisciplinary field. So, I guess, what did you find the value in sort of forming it as its own area and trying to establish it as its own area, as opposed to being so scattered?
Yeah, well, it has to do with sort of the fluidity of interaction. It's always easier to collaborate inside a department than it is across departments. I would say CMU is really great at breaking down departmental and college barriers in ways that are, stronger than other places, but it's still easier to collaborate in the department. So Chris and I just sort of walked out of a faculty meeting, and there were people there from all sorts of disciplines, and informal interaction is really important for how organizations work. And just the fact that we have a regularly scheduled meeting and I see people, I worked a little, I just mentioned Bobby Klatsky, but she was a couple of seats down from me in this meeting, and I was talking to her about a project we're starting. That kind of informal opportunity is really important, and that's what a department and really a field discipline creates. And it just makes interaction easier. Interdisciplinary work is hard. It's always hard. So you really want to work to reduce the barriers.
Chris, you mentioned you were Scott's PhD student. So, what was that like? Did you talk about how that sort of mentorship has helped you throughout your career?
I was very fortunate to have Scott as my advisor because he gave me an exceptionally long leash. As long, his sort of mantra was, I will take care of the fundraising, and your job is to do the best research you can do, because grow into a scholar. And that independence was a real blessing for me because it let me grow and become an academic myself. And not everyone in the world gets that level of freedom, and that's very much a personality style of your advisor. And Scott had to write a lot of grants behind the scenes to enable me to have that flexibility, but not distract me with it, right? That's sort of the messy side of the job. And so with that freedom, I was incredibly prolific and able to explore a huge amount of terrain very quickly. And also, Scott had a good nose for interesting areas. So I was really early. Also, one of Scott's former students had moved into utilizing machine learning, which at the time, now it seems so obvious, machine learning sensors human-computer interaction. It's like, they're like this. But actually, very few people were doing machine learning at the time. And Scott's former student, James Fogarty, was really one of the first in the community to say, well, humans have to be sensed by sensors, but that's just a pile of numbers. You have to make inferences off that data. And so Scott kind of, I didn't know anything about machine learning when I first came to CMU. And he's like, you need to learn about it. And that became, really kind of a bedrock of a lot of the kind of technologies that I've developed since. So yeah, very fortuitous. And CMU obviously was a great place on top of that. So there's many layers to the onion, and all of them were beneficial.
It's really interesting. And I think you also mentioned earlier that Scott and you both have a very, you said eclectic area, like different areas of research. So I found that really interesting because I've always seen academia as you sort of pick your niche subfield that you're really interested in and you just become really good at that one field. But you both seem to say that you have many varied interests. So I don't know, could you just talk a bit more about how that works? How are you able to become so prolific with so many different areas of the field?
Well, I think this is a bit of a research style and personality issue. One thing I tell people asking those kinds of questions is that there's really no one right way to do research. The kind of style that you described as in contrast to this, a lot of people have that style, and a lot of people are very successful at it, of sort of being very focused. It has just not been the way I've gone about things. And I think it's important for people to find the right way to do their work that suits them. And my style does not suit everybody. I, I think it suited Chris pretty well, and obviously it suited me, but it's not the right thing for everyone. And there are there are definitely advantages for being more focused than I am, but then there are advantages for my style of what I work on is what I decided in the morning was really cool to work on today because it'll be fun. Um, except there's always a theme to that. Yes, I do what's fun, but deciding what is fun it has a lot of theme to it over time.
No, I agree with Scott. You have to find your own style, and it's a style that works for me and Scott, and it makes you nimble. But yes, I think actually we're in the minority, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. Most people, their advice they would dispense, and they followed in their own career, is you go for extreme depth. You're the world's expert in one thing, whatever that is, and the next 50 papers are going to be on that topic, and that's great. And I'm very glad there's researchers doing that in the world because that does cultivate deep expertise. I think HCI is sufficiently new that there's so much terrain to cover that we also need explorers that are ambly moving across that whole terrain, and being eclectic can be very useful. We haven't solved human computer interaction. I'm not sure we're ready to even necessarily go deep in a lot of areas. Some things, sure, we understand it pretty well, but there's some areas that we don't even know if it's even worth going deep because we haven't barely even scratched the surface. So, computational fabrication is a great example of that. I think is an area. It's like it's cool, it's interesting, but what's the what? We need to uncover the use cases, be excited about the use cases ourselves before we really invest in the depth.
Moving on to your current research. So, Chris, I believe you are the head of CMU's Future Interfaces Lab, and you've mentioned that you've worked on a lot of unique interface tech. So, do you think you could pick your favorite project that you've worked on, maybe, and just explain what the development process was like?
It's really hard to pick a favorite because there's so many favorites. I really enjoy doing what I do. I think a recent favorite, my most recent favorite is probably the work called Fluid Reality. This was a whole new way to do haptic actuation, basically like shape shifting pixels. It was a technique that was already existed in sort of the micro lab on chip kind of literature. So people knew about it from a fluid dynamics perspective, but no one had ever thought about the human computer interaction implications or even haptic applications of that technology. And when you again, this is the value of being multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, perhaps, is you can identify technology in some totally random field and you can pluck it out of sort of obscurity and you apply it to a problem that no one's thought of before, and you can make a step function improvement in that. If you look at other technologies trying to do what we did in this paper, we can did a 10x improvement in 5 different dimensions, and we reduced the size by probably more like 100x. We reduced the cost also probably by like 100x compared to using valves and pumps and tubes, and really the state of the art that was before this paper. So that does strike me as a real gem when you're able to make that substantive of a advance. And again, it was like a 6 months of work, maybe 1 year of work to do that. but we made such a huge improvement over the prior work that people had spent years or even decades trying to advance. So it just shows you that if you have the right idea and the right people, you can make really amazing advances pretty quickly. That's definitely a recent favorite of mine.
It's quite interesting. I guess that might also be a benefit of the field being so new because there's so many unexplored dimensions to it. Are there any challenges that come along with the field being so new where you guys are kind of having to lay the groundwork as well as explore new and better ways to solve existing problems?
I would say that actually things are sort of more grounded and more established than they were in the old days. We were really struggling to just sort of figure out some of the basics, which are now sort of taken for granted as part of HCI. And because we really weren't seen as a discipline and we were seen as a piece of something else, there was always a huge amount of work being done to fit HCI work into something else, and laying the groundwork for it being important and figuring out which of the problems were important. So I would say, despite the fact that we've grown a lot, it's actually, in terms of laying groundwork and that kind of thing, a lot easier than it used to be. We sort of are a lot more grounded. We have a lot better understanding of what HCI is than the old days. That said, there has been this tremendous growth in different sets of topics, but I think that that's largely played to our strength, which is our ability to sort of be nimble and to be interdisciplinary and to if you take interdisciplinary seriously, then you have to be light on your feet in terms of methodologies and finding and adopting new ways to do things. And that's always been a part of our success. And that is particularly important as things sort of grow bigger and wider in HCI.
All right. Scott, do you think you could elaborate on maybe how you've seen this within any fields you were working on? I know you mentioned that a lot of your work was in computational fabrication in general, but do you think we could have some examples about maybe some projects you worked on that maybe could springboard off the fact that HCI had become more grounded?
Well, I would say, almost all of the things which were sort of more interdisciplinary for me were really helped by that sort of grounding of what HCI was and really seeing it here as an interdisciplinary endeavor. I almost always point back to just, my ability now to do interdisciplinary work and to rapidly sort of figure out what another discipline is about and be able to go off to their literature. So, as you said, computational fabrication. So I'm now reading lots of papers in material science and mechanical engineering, which, had nothing to do with my training in education or really my prior research. Uh, but I have learned to be able to quickly shift and adopt and to understand, be able to understand a new field or subfield as a result of having done it. That helps almost everything I do. And certainly, as I say, computational fabrication is definitely bringing in a set of new areas that I hadn't dealt with before. And
I
yet
know you
I
both
sort
mentioned
of have
being very
managed to pretty
adventurous
quickly get up to
with where
speed
you take your
and be
research.
able to
And I
make
know, Scott,
good
you
use
mentioned
of
how
those things
you're
in other
kind of
disciplines.
constantly reading
So to
up
me, it really boils
papers in
down
new
into
fields and trying to
interdisciplinary work.
build your
Interdisciplinary
understanding
work is very
into like a
powerful.
whole different
It
topic
allows you to
that
do
you
things
weren't
that lots of
familiar
people,
with.
other people
And
can't.
I know that would take, I'm sure, a lot of energy and dedication. And there is this risk, right, associated with, oh, like, what if this isn't the right direction, and what if this ends up going in a place that isn't what you imagined? Have you guys ever felt this, I guess, hesitation or fear venturing into kind of this unknown field?
No, I think that's actually part of the fun of the job. I'm never like fearful of it. I mean, I might be confused by it, but I'm not worried.
Well, and I think the way I would answer that is that I do that all the time. I do. There's all sorts of stuff that you just never hear about that I spent time on. It didn't pan out, And that's just part of the way I do the work. I don't show you everything, or it's not worth showing, perhaps. And I certainly don't fear it, and I don't stop doing it. And I accept that I spend time on things that don't pan out. I do that all the time. It's part of it. Although one of the things I find is that there are things that I expended effort on learning about and thinking about 10, 15 years ago, which suddenly show up again. And a lot of times the things that seem like they didn't go anywhere and maybe were wasted show up in a different context, or new technological enablers show up. So some of the things which, I might have thought were, dead ends, sometimes come back and they're not so dead. So I in no way fear doing that. Again, this is a little bit of a research style and a personality style, but that to me is like incredibly important to do it, because it makes you light on your feet. It makes it so that I can feel free to pivot whenever it seems appropriate. And to me, that offers a big advantage.
For our project, Tia and I and our teammates, we've looked at hundreds of papers, I think, that HCI has produced, and I'm very, very amazed when I see like traces of certain papers pretty much in our daily lives. Like, for example, Chris, you mentioned like context-aware computing, how like computers can make sense of the situation it's in to make use of that information and do something with it. And then I would see papers like before 2000, like before we were even born, mentioning these things and trying to do something to further that.
I did have a question based on this. What you guys said about how research from maybe 10 years ago came back completely unexpectedly, it made me think about a remark I heard, I think from a NASA scientist regarding funding, where they just sort of believed that it was unnecessarily difficult to get funding for research that was seen as quote unquote not useful, because it like the use case for that research can come back at a completely unexpected time. I don't know if this might be a bit taboo to ask, but do you think there is a such thing as completely useless research, or perhaps any areas of study that genuinely might not go anywhere?
I would say, more than 50% of the ideas that I have don't go anywhere. And I don't know for sure that they're useless. I hope that they're not, but they don't immediately pan out. And a lot of them, and I say some of them come back, but some of them don't. And the problem is, though, that you don't know at the time which is which. That's really sort of the fundamental thing. But it's got to be the case that there's a ton of research that ends up being, not as useful as we might have liked, let's just say. But you don't know until you do it, until you push it, and you give it some time to see if it comes back to life in maybe a slightly different setting or for a different problem. And I think even the most successful of us can't really predict which 75% of our ideas are not so great. And so being willing to do the parts that don't pan out is still very important.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think probably more than 75% of papers end up being pretty useless. It might be more like 90 or 95. But Scott's 100% right that no one is setting out to do useless research, because then you just wouldn't do it if you knew that. No, that's not a good use of your time or funding, or no one's doing useless research. It may turn out to be useless later, and you might just hit dead ends. It's unexpected. You can maybe try to be better or worse kind of hit rate on which ideas have utility or not. I kind of liken it to throwing darts. Like, I'm not a particularly good darts player, but if you give me 100 darts or 1,000 darts, not even that much practice, I can just go. I'll probably get a bullseye, right? And it doesn't matter. No one cares about the 999 darts that hit the wall. They care about the one that actually hit the bullseye. And so you can be good at research and have impact, but then you have to be prolific. You can either take your one dart and really practice and try and getting a bullseye might still be difficult for you, or you can be an experimentalist. You can be an explorer, and you can throw a lot more darts. And then I'd be like, oh well, that's actually turned out to be a lot more interesting, a lot more useful than you might have guessed, even maybe at the beginning of the project. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, but no one's doing useless research.
Yeah.
Right. That's the key insight here. No one's doing that right now.
Yeah. And I would say, with your dart analogy, there's a lot of middle ground. I think over time, as you throw your 1,000 darts, you're going to learn to get better
as
and
well.
better.
Yep.
And there's a lot of middle ground between these kinds of approaches. As I say, there's not one good way to be successful as a researcher. There's lots of ways to do it, and everybody needs to find their way.
I just want to mention how I think it's really relieving to hear that not even, the researchers who are at pretty much like the forefront of technology really know where we're headed. And I guess that would lead to my next question is, where do you guys see the HCI field heading for the next 30 years for both the field and also the CMU HCII?
So just to add on to your first part of your statement, one of the reasons why we don't know if something is going to necessarily have impact is because we're operating on a much farther time horizon than companies like Microsoft or Apple or Samsung or whatever, pick one of your tech giants, have to do. They are having impact. They're literally working on products they're trying to ship in 2025. Right? Scott and I are trying to think about technology ideas that aren't even in Apple or Samsung or Microsoft's engineers' minds. So when you're trying to do a time travel, right, is you're going to end up being a lot more speculative. That's why our hit rate is less. That's why maybe only 10% of our papers have utility, because things just veered off in a totally different direction. But that's important still, because we want to be ahead. We want to explore, because then we can, if we find something that's really exciting, but it might be 10 years away from being practical, but we can show, hey, if we could get to this is a really cool thing, then we can actually steer industry to get the products to go in that direction. But if you're at Facebook, you're at Apple, and you're trying to think about a product, what's going to go into the iPhone 16, what's going to go into the iPhone 17, that's a lot less risky in many ways, because they kind of know, okay, well, we want to get a better camera, we want to do this or that. Research, especially in academia, is fundamentally a different thing. We're getting paid and enlisting the brightest minds to do a totally different task. With respect to your second question, HCI, I think, will continue to grow. It's already had explosive growth over the past 20, 30 years. I think it's actually not likely to slow down anytime soon, actually. And that's because hardware, like processors, have been commoditized. I would venture to guess that you don't even know how fast the processor is in your smartphone or how much RAM your smartphone has. You just get the next model, and that's all you really know about. So a lot of the things that we took, that we cared about in computing have sort of become invisible to us. And what we care about, why people buy an iPhone, is because they want the interactive features, all the human-facing features. Is it secure? Does it take good photographs? Those are all about utility to the person, not about the processor speed or anything like that. And so if that's the differentiator for why you're going to buy one product over another, HCI is going to have to be at the forefront of all those things. Apple has to compel you to buy the next iPhone, and I guarantee you it'll be about user-facing features, because you're not going to care about anything else. So I think, in terms of industrial growth, it's going to continue to grow, and I think it certainly as an academic discipline, I think if I had to guess, the size of our undergraduate program is probably going to 10x or something on that order over the next 30 years.
That's scary.
Yeah, and the same way computer science is growing.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think I get asked this question on a somewhat regular basis of what's going to happen in the future, and I almost always say I'm really bad at predicting the future. I have enough of a track record to know not to do that as much as anything else. And I don't usually go at my work and what I do from the point of view of, here's what I think the future is. It's much more so here's the future I would like to see, and how do I make that happen, as opposed to feeling like I have any idea of what the field or what the world is going to be like in 30 years.
Then I suppose maybe I should rephrase my question to, what do you hope to see in the next 30 years? Would that be more up your alley?
Yeah, maybe.
You can take your time to think about it if you need to. It's a packed question, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, you'd think I think about this all the time. I do, but
Right.
yeah, well, and unpacking it into simple answers is probably the hard part here. I think there's been tremendous improvement in the ability to use the tremendous power of computation. I was trained as a computer scientist, and sort of I had a very early understanding of the tremendous power that comes with computation and our ability to actually apply that to what we do every day, what we, basically making people's lives better has dramatically improved over sort of my career. But that's pretty high level, but that's really where I think most of us really want to take this. It's really about, at least from my perspective, taking, this tremendous power of computation and getting it into the service of people to do what they want to do with it. And there have been tremendous advances, but I don't think we're very far into that at this point. There's a lot, just so much more to be done there. Not very specific, but I try not to be specific about the future because I've been wrong so many times.
So you probably hit the bullseye there. So before we leave, I think we have time for just one last question, which is that do you guys have any advice for any people who are maybe wanting to get more into research in HCI or just in general?
Well, what I would do, my advice to undergrads is you can go to the HCI webpage and you can look at the faculty and visit all their web pages. And you can obviously learn a lot from what they put on their webpage, but better yet is to look at the most recent papers that have come out of those groups, because some of those are going to be research papers with undergrads on them. So you don't have to imagine what undergrads might be doing as researchers in those groups. You can literally see the output, non-hypothetically, of what that research team is producing. And if you read that paper and say, my gosh, this is really interesting, I wish I was on this paper, then that's a really good cue. And then obviously send an email. There's people coming and going all the time. Often at the beginning of the semesters is a great time to reach out to faculty, and many faculty use lists that are assembled in the School of Computer Science that say, here's all the help that we need with projects, but also just email directly. And worst case they'll say is, no, there's no openings at this time, which is probably the most likely answer that you're going to get. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. The worst answer will be no. So find the faculty that are interesting to you, that are doing things that you're interested in, that you have a skill set you think you could help. Obviously, if a lab is doing a huge amount with electrical engineering and you know nothing about electrical engineering, that might be more of a tenuous connection. So find something where you can have value, or take the classes that you would need to build up that expertise and then speak to those faculty. But fundamentally, just reach out. Faculty are actually pretty friendly. We're humans too, and we love getting emails from undergrads that are excited about doing research.
I guess I will say that research as an endeavor is not for everyone. I absolutely love it. I couldn't see myself doing anything else, and I think that's true of a lot of other people. But that's my passion, and it's maybe not for everybody to want to do it. But I think the interesting thing is try it out, give it a shot. See if it's something that you want to do. And what Chris has said in terms of approach to us as faculty is exactly the way to do that. Is sort of come in, find a group, work with a group. Tons and tons of interesting projects going on in the HCII and around CMU, and it's the kind of thing that I think you can figure out pretty quickly. I think a lot of people see what goes on there and say, wow, yeah, this is cool. This is what I want to do. But you do need to try it out. And it's not actually for everybody. But if you think it might be for you, then the simple advice is, get involved a bit. You can do it on a sort of low commitment starting basis. And usually it's pretty clear to you.
Yeah, as someone whose first experience to research was this project this summer, it's really reassuring to hear. It's really nice to hear. All right, so Scott and Chris, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your insights and experience. It was really interesting to hear. I think the dartboard analogy is probably going to stay with me for a while. So we've linked several of Chris and Scott's papers in the description of this podcast if you guys want to go take a look. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It helps us reach more people. All right, then we'll see you guys next time.
All right, well, thank you.
HCI Ideas is a podcast celebrating the 30th anniversary of Carnegie Mellon's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow us and recommend it to your friends. We'd really appreciate it. To learn more about the research done at HCII, our friends have created a website showcasing the papers we talked about today, as well as many more. You can find this at www.hcii30.com. That's 30 with a 30. We just think it's so cool. Thank you for listening to HCI Ideas, and we'll catch you next time.